I want you to picture a detective for a moment. Let's call him Medlock Holmes.
Right. Okay. Medlock Holmes.
Yes. And he has spent his entire career investigating these really sudden, violent ends, the heart attacks, massive traumas, swift infections that just stop a life dead in its tracks.
The acute things.
Exactly. But today, Holmes steps into a completely different kind of space. He arrives at what we'll call the Hall of Human Burden.
Sounds quite intense.
It is, yeah. It's this vast, echoing, sort of surreal chamber. And there are no microscopes here. There are no MRI scanners humming in the corner, no genetic maps on the tables.
Just something completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead, the walls of this immense hall are just entirely covered in clocks, millions and millions of them.
And if you're standing in the center of that hall, I mean, the sheer noise of it would just be overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely deafening. And he starts to notice the variations in how they're built, because some of these clocks, they've just simply stopped.
Right, their hands are frozen.
Exactly, frozen at really early hours. And those represent illnesses that kill swiftly and prematurely. Those are the cases he's used to.
The traditional public health metrics.
Yeah. But then he walks over to another section of the wall, and the clocks in this section, they are still ticking. The pendulums are swinging.
But there's a problem with the mechanism.
A massive problem. The hands are moving, but the gears are visibly grinding. You can almost hear the metal scraping together.
Like they're laboring under this immense invisible friction.
Spot on. These clocks represent lives lived with profound, heavy, chronic disability. The life hasn't ended, but the passage of time is just weighed down.
And schizophrenia overwhelmingly belongs to this second group of clocks.
It really does. Which brings us to the center of this hall.
Yeah, if we place a monument right in the very center, it would be this enormous ancient balance scale.
And what's on it?
Well, on the fulcrum of that scale, you have 4 letters engraved. D-A-L-Y. D-A-L-Y.
Disability-adjusted life years.
Exactly. Because to truly understand the footprint of a disease, you cannot simply count the death certificates. I mean, many illnesses kill, right?
Right.
But others steal decades of healthy living while the clock just continues to run.
We have to measure the friction in the gears.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. So one side of this giant scale is engraved with YL years of life lost. That's your premature mortality.
The frozen clocks.
Exactly. And the other side reads YLD years lived with disability, the grinding clocks.
So the mission of our deep dive today is to examine that scale really closely.
Yes. We're using Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry as our structural spine today.
To explore the global burden of schizophrenia, we're going to map its footprint across the globe, and really understand the true multifaceted cost of this illness.
But keeping in mind throughout all of this, our foundational anchor, that psychiatry is fundamentally the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact and how that exact process can go wrong.
We're looking at biology, we're looking at the social environment, and the spaces where those two things violently collide.
Perfectly said.
Now, to understand this burden, we first have to look at how global disease is actually measured. Because that DALY scale we just talked about, it wasn't always there.
No, not at all. Before the 1990s, if a public health official wanted to know what was hurting humanity the most, they essentially just looked at a graveyard.
They just counted the dead?
Yeah. Mortality was the primary metric. Public health focused on what was actively ending lives. Infectious diseases, malnutrition, maternal mortality.
Which makes sense, but it creates a massive blind spot, doesn't it?
It creates an enormous blind spot. So in the early 1990s, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the Harvard School of Public Health sort of got together and initiated the Global Burden of Disease Study.
The GBD.
Right. Now run by the IHME at the University of Washington. And they realized that, a disease might not put you in the ground, but it might completely strip you of your ability to work.
Or to maintain relationships or live independently.
Exactly. They needed a metric for suffering, not just dying.
So that's how the DALY was born.
Yes. One DALY corresponds to 1 year of healthy life lost in a given population. And the formula, as we said, is elegantly simple, but really impactful. DALY equals YLL plus YLD.
It forces clinicians to actually look at morbidity.
Clinicians and policymakers, crucially. The people holding the funding strings have to look at the chronic, grinding nature of an illness.
Because the math of suffering changes everything.
It really does.
And when we apply this new lens to schizophrenia using the GBD 2019 data, this massive paradox emerges in the textbook.
Let's hear it.
So, among 25 to 49-year-olds globally, schizophrenia ranks 22nd in total dailies. It accounts for 1.5% of the total disease burden for that prime age demographic.
Which is an enormous footprint.
It is. But wait, I have to push back here because the lifetime prevalence of schizophrenia is relatively low, right?
Yeah, it hovers around 0.7%, so roughly 7 people per 1,000.
Just a fraction of a percent of the global population. So how does an illness that affects fewer than 1 in 100 people generate a top-tier global burden? I mean, outranking hundreds of much more common diseases.
It's a brilliant question, and the answer lies in clinical reasoning regarding the trajectory and the timing of the disease.
The timing.
Yes. We have to look at when the illness strikes. Schizophrenia characteristically emerges during late adolescence or early adulthood.
So right in that 18 to 25 window.
Exactly. Think about the developmental milestones compressed into those specific years.
Oh, wow, yeah. That's the critical window for literally everything. You're detaching from your parents, maybe entering higher education.
Establishing your first serious romantic relationships.
Entering the workforce.
Yeah.
Basically building the scaffolding for your entire adult identity.
And that is precisely when the psychosis hits. It doesn't just disrupt a year of life, it completely derails the entire trajectory of social maturation.
Because the clocks keep ticking.
Yes. It steals decades of healthy, productive life. A patient diagnosed at 20 might live to be 60 or 65. That is 40 years of severe impairment in their ability to function independently.
So the YLD, the years lived with disability, it just accumulates massively.
It pushes that side of the scale down with incredible force.
Mm-hmm.
Globally, we're seeing a shift from communicable diseases to non-communicable ones, and from premature death to years lived with disability.
Though it's worth noting the burden of premature mortality in schizophrenia is actually likely underestimated. We'll get into that later.
We certainly will.
But the disability side of the scale is so heavy because it's pulling down on the absolute prime years of human potential.
Precisely.
But, you know, before public health officials could measure this burden on a global map, the medical community actually had to recognize the illness globally.
Right, they had to define it.
And looking backward at the mechanisms of how this disease was first categorized, it reveals some really fascinating historical blind spots.
The 19th century is really where the modern conceptualization begins. If you go back and review Western medical literature prior to the late 1700s, it's quite interesting.
What do you find?
Well, you find expensive, vivid descriptions of mania, melancholy, and dementia.
Right.
But explicit descriptions of the symptom cluster we now recognize as schizophrenia. They are remarkably scarce.
That is strange. I know Philippe Pinel in France offered some early glimpses.
He did, yeah. He described patients with unconnected ideas and shallow dissociated emotions living this kind of automatic existence.
But the syndrome itself lacked a name. It lacked a boundary.
Exactly. It wasn't until Emile Kraepelin in 1896 coined the term dementia precox, which means early dementia.
And then Eugen Boiler later refined it to schizophrenia.
Right. That's when the entity really took shape.
But this raises a profound sociological question for me. I mean, did schizophrenia suddenly infect the 19th century like a new viral contagion? Or did humanity just buy a new pair of diagnostic glasses?
It's definitely the new glasses. The underlying biological vulnerability was undoubtedly always present in the human gene pool.
So what actually changed?
The environmental and sociological mechanisms of the 19th century.
Yeah.
European societies were rapidly industrializing and urbanizing.
Ah, the shift from the farm to the factory.
Exactly that. And that shift completely altered communities' tolerance for bizarre or unproductive behavior.
How so?
Well, think about a dispersed agrarian setting. An individual experiencing mild to moderate negative symptoms. So, a motivation, social withdrawal, flattened affect. They might still be integrated.
Right. They could perform repetitive, solitary physical tasks. Chopping wood, tending animals.
The extended family network had the space to absorb the burden.
But you take that same individual and you place them in a cramped tenement in industrial London or Munich.
Yes.
And demand they operate complex machinery in a noisy, highly structured factory environment. The social fabric just tears.
They can't cope, and the community can no longer hide them or absorb them, which led directly to the asylum era.
The massive institution.
Yes. For context, between 1873 and 1905 in Austria, the proportion of individuals classified as insane who were institutionalized jumped from 32.5% to nearly 62%.
Wow, that is an unprecedented concentration.
It really was. And because of that, clinicians like Kraepelin suddenly had thousands of patients under one roof. When you consolidate that much pathology, the statistical noise clears and the clinical signals emerge.
He could walk the wards and finally see the patterns.
He could finally separate the episodic mood disorders from the chronic deteriorating trajectory of dementia precox.
So the asylums actually provided the sample size needed to define the disease.
Exactly.
But this entirely Western industrialized lens created a massive myth, didn't it?
It did. The idea that schizophrenia was purely a disease of civilization.
Right. For decades in the early 20th century, colonial psychiatrists believed that true schizophrenia just didn't exist in indigenous or non-Western populations.
The ethnopsychiatry of that era was steeped in colonial paternalism and, frankly, outright biological racism.
The textbook highlights figures like John Carruthers for this.
Yeah. So Carruthers published a monograph in 1953 observing mental illness in Africa. And he noted that African patients rarely exhibited the highly systematized, complex delusions seen in European patients.
But instead of looking at the cultural context for that difference,
Right.
he blamed biology.
He actually hypothesized a congenital underdevelopment of the frontal lobes in African populations.
Which is just appalling.
It's horrific. The underlying assumption was that non-Western minds were simply too simple to construct a proper European-style delusion, and therefore they couldn't possibly have real schizophrenia.
It took a whole generation of post-colonial, locally born psychiatrists to finally tear down those racist frameworks.
Pioneers like Thomas A. Lambo in Nigeria, who established the first psychiatric villages.
And Pao Meng Yap in Asia, who rigorously charted mental illness in local populations.
Yes, they proved that the illness was absolutely there, it just wore different cultural clothing.
And all of this culminated in massive epidemiological efforts by the World Health Organization.
Specifically, the International Pilot Study of Schizophrenia, the IPSS, and the 10-country study.
What did those studies actually do?
They deployed standardized diagnostic criteria across 16 geographic areas worldwide. They trained local clinicians to look for the core symptoms rather than Western cultural manifestations.
And the map lit up.
Every single continent.
No society, no matter how isolated or traditional, was free from schizophrenia, which really forces us to look at the biological mechanisms.
Absolutely.
If this disease is an omnipresent shadow of the human condition, the blueprint must be etched incredibly deep in our genetics.
And the search for that blueprint reached a watershed moment with modern genome-wide association studies, or GWAS.
Right, these massive genetic scans.
The landmark GWAS analyzed the genomes of 36,989 individuals with schizophrenia and over 113,000 healthy controls.
That is a staggering sample size.
A study of that magnitude requires immense computational power to scan millions of genetic variants. And they ultimately identified 108 distinct genomic loci, significantly associated with the risk of developing the illness. 108 different genetic hotspots.
Yes.
But a location on a map doesn't really tell us what the building actually does. How do these loci translate into the neurobiology of psychosis?
Well, the findings were actually a brilliant validation of our clinical pharmacology.
How so?
One of the strongest signals came from a gene coding for the dopamine D2 receptor, DRD2.
Oh, wow. And for over half a century, our primary antipsychotic medications have worked by blocking that exact receptor.
Exactly. The genetic data confirmed that dopaminergic dysregulation isn't just a side effect of the illness, it is fundamentally wired into the genetic risk.
So we knew the drugs worked, and the genetics finally proved we were hitting the right target.
Precisely. Furthermore, the study highlighted numerous genes involved in glutamatergic neurotransmission.
Glutamate.
Yes. Glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. It's essentially the accelerator pedal for neural signaling.
So what happens if that system is faulty? If the glutamatergic system is faulty, the brain struggles to distinguish salient signals from background noise, which provides a highly plausible mechanism for how hallucinations and delusions form.
The brain just starts giving intense meaning to random noise.
Exactly.
But the textbook points out a massive plot twist in this genetic data which blew my mind.
Yes.
The strongest signal.
The most glaring red flag in all those 108 loci wasn't dopamine, and it wasn't glutamate.
No, it wasn't. The most robust statistical association was actually found on chromosome 6.
And for you listening, if you haven't looked at a genetic map recently, what resides on chromosome 6?
The major histocompatibility complex, or MHC.
The MHC.
Yeah. This is the genetic region that controls the acquired immune system. It governs how the body recognizes foreign invaders and manages inflammation.
Wait, We are talking about a psychiatric disorder characterized by hearing voices and losing touch with reality, and the strongest genetic link points to the immune system.
It does.
I'm going to need an explain like I'm 5 for how the MHC connects to the brain. It is truly one of the most exciting frontiers in modern neuroscience. We are learning that the immune system doesn't just fight infections. It actually plays a critical role in sculpting the brain.
Sculpting it.
Yeah. During late adolescence, right when schizophrenia typically emerges, the brain undergoes a massive process called synaptic pruning. It essentially clears out unused neural connections to make the brain more efficient for adulthood.
Okay, like trimming the dead branches off a tree so the main trunk grows stronger.
That's a perfect analogy. And we now believe that immune molecules, regulated by the MHC, are the gardeners doing the pruning.
Oh, wow.
Right? So if the MHC is genetically altered, the immune system might become overactive in the brain. It creates a state of neuroinflammation.
And it prunes too aggressively.
Exactly. It strips away critical neural circuits, leading to the devastating cognitive decline and psychosis we see in schizophrenia.
That completely reframes the entire illness.
It really does. But we have to caveat this. Even with 108 loci and these massive immune revelations, the textbook notes that these common genetic variants only explain about 30% of the estimated heritability.
So we have the genetic blueprint, but we are still missing 70% of the construction materials.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
The blueprint requires an environment to manifest.
The genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger.
A classic phrasing, but very accurate. This interaction between our shared human biology and vastly different local environments dictates how the illness actually presents in the clinic.
Which brings us nicely to the clinical manifestations. If the genetic risk is homologous worldwide, what does the phenotype, the actual observed characteristics of the disease look like across different cultures?
Well, the core of the illness remains remarkably consistent. Remember, we still lack a definitive biological marker.
Right. A psychiatrist cannot just order an MRI or a blood test to diagnose schizophrenia.
No. Imaging is only used to rule out organic causes, like a frontal lobe tumor. Diagnosis relies entirely on the clinical interview and observing the phenotype.
And you're saying the universal phenomenological experiences are striking.
They are. A patient in downtown Manhattan and a patient in a rural farming village in Nigeria will both describe hallucinatory voices speaking about them in the third person.
And thought broadcasting, right?
Yes. The terrifying belief that their private internal thoughts are being transmitted aloud to the people around them.
And perhaps most universally debilitating are the negative symptoms.
Definitely. We see profound psychomotor poverty, where movement and speech become incredibly sparse.
And avolition.
Avolition, yes. A complete loss of the drive to initiate goal-directed activities. The patient might sit for hours staring at a wall, totally disconnected from the social world. That tragedy translates across all borders.
But the culturally specific flavors layered on top of those core symptoms are just fascinating. You mentioned Nigeria earlier.
Yes. The textbook highlights a specific symptom complex noted by Nigerian psychiatrists.
What do they see?
Well, alongside the core psychosis, they frequently observe severe anxiety, vague hypochondriacal somatic complaints, and bizarre magico-mystical ideas.
So incorporating local spiritual or witchcraft frameworks into the delusion?
Exactly. The delusion uses the vocabulary of the patient's culture. They also see episodic twilight or confusional states.
There's also a stark contrast in how the illness actually begins.
Yes, the onset.
In India and Nigeria, acute onset, where the psychosis erupts suddenly and intensely, characterized 40.3% of the cases.
A very high percentage.
But in Europe and North America, acute onset was observed in only 10.9% of cases.
Which is a massive difference.
It is. Furthermore, catatonic symptoms, where the patient might freeze in rigid postures or exhibit hyperactive, purposeless movement, were seen in 10.3% of cases in traditional settings, compared to just 1.2% in the West.
I really must ask why this discrepancy exists.
Is it a reflection of subtle variations in the genetic subpopulations?
Or does a traditional rural environment interact differently with a breaking mind? Because in the West, the onset is often insidious.
A slow, creeping withdrawal over months or even years before the first overt hallucination.
Right. Perhaps the environmental stressors in traditional societies act as sharper, more acute triggers, resulting in a sudden break rather than a slow crumble.
To really explore how these environmental triggers work, we need to clarify the math of how we track the disease over time. We need to define incidence versus prevalence.
A vital distinction for anyone listening.
Go ahead.
Prevalence is a snapshot. It is the total proportion of individuals in a population who have the disease at a given time or across their lifetime.
It tells you the total burden currently existing.
Right. Incidence, however, measures the rate of new cases developing within a specific time frame, usually a year.
So, to use a bathtub analogy, incidence is the water flowing out of the tap. Prevalence is the total amount of water sitting in the tub.
That's an excellent visual, yes.
Yeah.
So if we look at the global numbers, the median lifetime prevalence is about 7.2 per 1,000 people.
The water in the tub.
The water in the tub. The incidence, the new water flowing in, is roughly 0.22 per 1,000 people per year.
Now, when you look at national averages, those numbers seem incredibly stable globally. But the textbook points out that when you zoom in on small geographic areas, that stability just completely shatters.
It does. We see wild spatial clustering.
The classic example is the rural Ireland anomaly.
Yes. Researchers looked at a socioeconomically homogeneous region in rural Ireland. The overall prevalence was totally standard, around 3.9 per 1,000.
But when they analyzed the data by small district electoral divisions,
The rates fluctuated wildly, from 0.0 in some districts to a staggering 29.4 per 1,000 in others.
I mean, how does one village have 0 cases and the village 10 miles down the road has almost 30 cases per 1,000?
It reveals the deep impact of genetic isolation and shared environmental stressors. In highly stable rural populations, extended families remain in the same microregion for generations.
So if a specific genetic vulnerability exists in that lineage, it just concentrates locally. But isolation can also create a fortress. The textbook mentions the Hutterite community in North America.
The Hutterites provide a phenomenal counterexample. They are an Anabaptist group living in highly isolated communal agrarian colonies.
And what was their prevalence?
Their lifetime prevalence of schizophrenia was found to be incredibly low, only 1.1 per 1,000.
Wow. A seventh of the global average.
The mechanisms here are likely dual. Firstly, a genetic founder effect. The original small population that established the colonies likely had a very low frequency of the schizophrenia risk alleles.
Makes sense.
But secondly, their environment is profoundly protective. It is a highly structured, mutually supportive community where expectations are clear, roles are defined, and social isolation is virtually impossible.
Which brings us to perhaps the most counterintuitive and heavily debated finding in modern psychiatric epidemiology.
The outcome paradox.
Right. Because the Hutterite example hints that how a society structures itself dramatically alters the trajectory of the disease.
We have to turn again to the WHO 10-country study.
What did they find regarding outcomes?
They tracked patients following their first episode of schizophrenia for several years, and the data revealed that outcomes were significantly better for patients in developing nations compared to those in highly developed, industrialized Western nations.
Let's look at the actual numbers because they are genuinely jarring.
Go ahead.
In developing countries, 62.7% of patients had complete remissions.
Okay.
In the developed world, places with advanced psychiatric hospitals, ubiquitous access to modern antipsychotics, and vast medical infrastructure, only 36.8% achieved complete remission.
It really forces a profound reevaluation of our medical model.
It does. The patients in developing nations had less access to formal health care. They often received no maintenance antipsychotic medication, yet they recovered at nearly double the rate.
Now, a skeptical listener is going to push back here.
I'm pushing back here. Are we just romanticizing poverty? Are we implying that living without running water or modern medicine is somehow a cure for severe neurodevelopmental disorder?
It is vital not to romanticize deprivation. The WHO researchers controlled for diagnostic differences meticulously. They were studying the exact same biological illness.
So what's driving the variance in outcome?
It's driven by psychosocial mechanisms. We have to look at the nature of stress itself. Henry Murphy, a prominent researcher, proposed 4 specific criteria for an environmental stressor to evoke a schizophrenic relapse.
Okay, what are the 4 criteria?
1, the situation demands action or a decision from the individual. 2, the information supplied to deal with the situation is highly complex or ambiguous.
Okay, action required, ambiguous information.
3, the situation persists if left unresolved. And 4, the individual has no escape route. They are completely trapped in the demand.
Honestly, if you apply those criteria to modern life in London or New York, it sounds like an average Tuesday.
Exactly. Modern Western society is defined by ambiguous, complex, inescapable demands. Navigating bureaucracies, maintaining a hyper-competitive career, parsing subtle social cues in a fragmented community.
And compare that to a traditional agrarian setting.
The physical labor is undeniably harder, but the cognitive and social demands are often far less ambiguous.
Right. If a patient is recovering from a psychotic break, trying to reintegrate into a modern office environment while dealing with cognitive deficits is basically a nightmare of Murphy's criteria.
The cognitive load triggers relapse, but in an agrarian setting, the demands harvesting a crop, tending livestock are concrete, visible, and structurally supported by the family.
That brings in the concept of expressed emotion, or EE.
Yes, high expressed emotion is a critical concept in psychiatry. It describes a family environment characterized by high levels of criticism, hostility, and emotional overinvolvement.
And what does that do biologically?
Returning to a high E home acts as a chronic stressor. It activates the patient's HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding the brain with cortisol.
Which is the stress hormone.
Yes, and that cortisol in turn sensitizes the dopaminergic system, directly triggering a return of psychotic symptoms.
So the family's hostility literally alters the brain chemistry of the patient.
It does. And cross-cultural studies demonstrate that high E family dynamics are significantly less prevalent in traditional societies, such as rural India, compared to urban centers in Denmark or the UK.
Why is that?
Traditional cultures often exhibit more fatalism or acceptance regarding the illness. They do not constantly criticize the patient for failing to achieve complex social milestones.
There's also the mechanism of the sick role, isn't there?
Yes. In the West, an individual diagnosed with schizophrenia is often permanently stamped with that identity. They're pushed onto long-term disability, removed from the workforce, and isolated.
Our society just doesn't have a place for a partially productive citizen.
Whereas in traditional economies, there is structural elasticity. A patient experiencing negative symptoms might not be able to run the farm, but they can still shell peas or watch children.
They retain a vital integrated role in the domestic economy.
They remain a person first and a patient second. The community acts as an external cognitive and social buffer.
But as much as we analyze these better outcomes, we really cannot look away from the darker reality of that DALY scale we discussed.
No, we cannot.
We need to talk about the YLL, the years of life lost, because the morbidity is devastating.
It is a profound tragedy. Individuals with schizophrenia lose, on average, 14 to 20 years of life expectancy compared to the general population.
That is just horrifying.
Specifically, the data indicates 18.7 years lost for men and 16.3 years lost for women.
2 decades of life gone. And when you read that, given the immense psychological suffering of psychosis, the immediate assumption is that suicide is the primary driver of this mortality gap.
Suicide is a major and tragic component, certainly. The suicide rate in schizophrenia is approximately 22 times higher than the general population.
22 times.
Yes. It accounts for about 28% of the excess mortality. And the risk peaks sharply in the first 6 months after the initial psychotic episode, as the patient fully grasps the reality of the diagnosis.
But you're going to tell me it's not the leading cause of premature death.
It is not.
So what is grinding the clocks to a halt so early?
Cardiovascular disease, CVD, and other common physical ailments.
Why are they dying of heart attacks in their 40s and 50s?
We have to examine what we call the lethal triad. It is a catastrophic collision of medical intervention, illness symptomatology, and lifestyle.
Break that down for us.
The first pillar of the triad is, paradoxically, our treatment.
The antipsychotics.
Yes. Second-generation atypical antipsychotics are phenomenal at silencing hallucinations, but they carry a severe metabolic cost. They disrupt leptin signaling and glucose metabolism,
Leading to?
massive rapid weight gain, profound insulin resistance, and the rapid onset of type 2 diabetes.
The medication saves the mind but sacrifices the body's metabolic engine.
That's a grim but accurate way to put it. The second pillar is the illness itself. The negative symptoms, amotivation, apathy result in a profoundly sedentary lifestyle.
The patient lacks the neural drive to exercise or prepare nutritious meals.
Exactly. And the third pillar is substance use, specifically a staggering rate of nicotine addiction.
The textbook cites an Australian survey where nearly 66% of patients with psychotic disorders were current smokers.
Yes. Nicotine provides a transient, mild cognitive enhancement and a brief dopamine hit in a brain that is otherwise struggling with reward processing.
So they're self-medicating.
They are, but the physical cost is devastating. When you combine drug-induced metabolic syndrome, extreme physical inactivity, and heavy chain smoking, You accelerate atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease by decades.
Which makes sense, and I imagine this compromised physical state makes them incredibly vulnerable to infectious diseases too.
Absolutely. During the recent pandemic, data showed that patients with schizophrenia had a COVID-19 mortality rate 3.27 times higher than healthy controls.
Wow. And the physical vulnerability is compounded by psychiatric comorbidity. The overall prevalence of substance use disorder is 41.7%.
They're desperately trying to self-medicate the negative symptoms and the anxiety. But cannabis use requires a specific spotlight here.
Right. Cannabis is not merely a comorbid coping mechanism, is it?
No, it is a direct, dose-dependent risk factor for the illness itself. The data is unequivocal. Individuals who are heavy users of cannabis have an odds ratio of 3.90 for developing psychotic disorders,
They are nearly 4 times as likely to cross the threshold into psychosis,
particularly if they use high-potency strains during early adolescence.
which links right back to the synaptic pruning we discussed.
Exactly. Introducing massive amounts of exogenous cannabinoids during the critical window of brain development disrupts the endocannabinoid system's role in neural maturation.
Dramatically increasing the risk of schizophrenia in those who carry the genetic blueprint.
Yes.
Now, when society hears about psychosis combined with substance abuse, the public imagination instantly conjures a very specific, stigmatizing image.
The violent, unpredictable schizophrenic.
Right. And we have to dismantle this using the Western Australian study.
It is the most pervasive, damaging, and statistically bankrupt myth in all of psychiatry.
So researchers tracked a massive cohort, every individual born in the state between 1955 and 1969. They cross-linked the criminal arrest registry with the psychiatric register to definitively answer who is actually committing the crimes.
And the results. Of all the criminal offenders in that massive cohort, only 1.7% had a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
1.7%. The vast, overwhelming majority of societal violence is perpetrated by people without any severe mental illness.
The grim reality is the exact inverse of the media narrative. People with severe mental illness are not the predators, they are the prey.
The annual prevalence of violent victimization for adults with psychotic disorders is 16.4%.
They are nearly 5 times more likely to be violently assaulted, robbed, or exploited than a member of the general population.
Because the illness pushes them to the margins?
Yes, they are often homeless, cognitively impaired, socially isolated, and forced to navigate the most dangerous strata of society without the protective buffers of family or financial security. They are profoundly vulnerable.
So if the system is preying on these vulnerable individuals, the obvious clinical imperative is to intervene before they are pushed to those margins. How do we stop the clocks from grinding down?
This introduces a critical metric, DUP, the duration of untreated psychosis.
DUP. It's exactly what it sounds like, right?
It is. It is the span of time between the onset of the first psychotic symptom, the first hallucination, the first paranoid delusion, and the initiation of adequate medical treatment.
And what does the World Health Organization recommend?
They strongly recommend a DUP of 12 weeks or lower.
3 months. That seems like a reasonable window to recognize a problem and seek help, but what is the actual reality on the ground?
The reality is a systemic failure. The median duration of untreated psychosis in the United States is estimated to be between 1 and 3 years.
A young adult, 19 years old, is living with untreated voices, terrifying paranoia, and cognitive decline for up to 3 years before they get professional help.
And those years are highly neurotoxic and socially devastating.
If you leave psychosis untreated during the most critical years of early adulthood, you guarantee what Ernest Grunberg termed the social breakdown syndrome.
Yes, the patient drops out of university, they alienate their peer group, they destroy their familial relationships, they fail to acquire vocational skills.
The illness methodically cuts every single tether connecting them to society.
And by the time they finally get a bed in a clinic 3 years later, the psychosis might be treatable with medication, but the social destruction is permanent.
The socioeconomic disadvantage becomes lifelong.
To combat this, modern psychiatry is shifting heavily toward clinical high-risk services and coordinated specialty care, or CSC.
How do those models work?
They do not wait for a full breakdown. The moment a first episode of psychosis is detected, a multidisciplinary team intervenes. They don't just prescribe an atypical antipsychotic, they provide intense cognitive behavioral therapy.
Family education to lower that expressed emotion we discuss.
And crucially, supported employment and education specialists.
They fight aggressively to keep the patient in school, in their job, and in their family unit before the social breakdown syndrome sets in.
Because the alternative is economically unsustainable.
The textbook highlights a jarring funding metric for this. 97% of the total lifetime costs associated with schizophrenia are incurred by fewer than 50% of the patients.
That statistic reveals two crucial truths. First, there is a hardcore subset of patients with highly treatment-resistant chronic illness who will require massive, lifelong institutional and social support.
Right.
But second, it proves that for the majority of patients, the disorder does not have to be completely disabling. If we intervene early and manage the environment, they do not have to fall into that 97% cost bracket.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we step out of the hall of human burden today.
Let's hear it.
We've seen the DALY scale. We've seen the WHO data proving that traditional social support, large kinship networks, and inclusive elastic community structures act as a potent, non-pharmacological buffer that dramatically improves recovery rates in developing nations.
We have.
Taking that a step further, it forces us to look in the mirror. Are our modern, hyper-individualistic, fragmented Western societies actually structurally schizophrenogenic? Can we ever truly treat this illness with a chemical molecule designed to block a dopamine receptor if what the human brain is desperately crying out for is a social one?
That is the ultimate challenge of the psychosocial model, and the very essence of why psychiatry must integrate the mind, the brain, and society.
Well, let's solidify the complex mental models we've built today. We have a few single best answer questions drawn directly from the concepts we've explored. I will pose the clinical scenario or concept to you, the listener.
I'll read the questions and the options. Take a moment to think through the mechanisms before we discuss the answer.
Here's the first one. We spent a lot of time in the hall of human burden.
Question 1. Which of the following best describes the primary driver of the high global daily burden, disability-adjusted life years associated with schizophrenia? Is it A, an extremely high point prevalence globally, B, unprecedented rates of communicable disease comorbidity, C, years of healthy life lost to chronic disability outstripping years lost to mortality, or D, high mortality from violent offending?
I'll give you a second.
If you recall the grinding clocks versus the frozen clocks, the answer is C, the chronic disability outstripping the mortality.
Oh.
While premature death is significant, the sheer weight of the daily burden comes from the illness striking in early adulthood and causing decades of functional impairment, the YLD, or years lived with disability.
Let's move to the biological mechanisms, specifically the massive GWS study.
Question 2. That study identified 108 genomic loci. Which novel physiological system was most strongly implicated by the association found on chromosome 6? Was it A, the dopaminergic system, B, the glutamatergic system, C, the immune system via the major histocompatibility complex, or D, the endocrine system?
I have a think.
While dopamine and glutamate loci were confirmed, the answer is C. The most robust and paradigm-shifting signal was on chromosome 6, pointing directly to the immune system and the major histocompatibility complex, opening up the frontier of neuroinflammation and aberrant synaptic pruning.
Question 3 requires some clinical reasoning regarding mortality.
Question 3. Imagine a 35-year-old male with a 15-year history of schizophrenia presenting for a routine checkup. Statistically, what is the most likely cause of premature mortality that threatens to reduce his life expectancy by nearly 2 decades? Is it A, suicide, B, cardiovascular disease, C, substance overdose, or D, an infectious disease like tuberculosis?
Think about the triad.
The lethal triad provides the answer here. It is B, cardiovascular disease. While suicide risk is elevated, particularly early in the illness, the combination of metabolic syndrome induced by antipsychotics, a sedentary lifestyle, and heavy smoking makes cardiovascular disease the leading killer.
Let's look at epidemiology and the outcome paradox.
Question 4. According to the WHO 10-country study, what is the truth regarding the course of schizophrenia in developing versus highly developed countries? Is it A, developed countries have higher rates of complete remission, B, developing countries have shorter symptom-free periods, C, developing countries have a significantly higher percentage of patients achieving sustained, complete remission, or D, there is no statistical difference in course?
This was the paradox.
Yes. The rigorous WHO data demonstrated the answer is C. Patients in developing nations experience a significantly more benign course, with a much higher percentage achieving and maintaining complete remission, likely due to protective psychosocial structures and lower expressed emotion.
Building on those environmental stressors, let's talk about Henry Murphy.
Question 5. Henry Murphy proposed 4 criteria for schizophrenia evoking stress. Which of these is not one of his criteria? A situation demanding action or decision. B, complexity or ambiguity of information. C, the person has an easy escape route available. Or D, the situation persists if unresolved.
Which one doesn't fit?
The answer is C. The incorrect criterion there is the easy escape route. Murphy's model explicitly requires that the individual has no escape route, leaving them trapped in the cognitively overwhelming and ambiguous demand, which triggers the relapse.
Final question, focusing on intervention.
Question 6. What is the most critical prognostic factor determining the likelihood of the social breakdown syndrome and lifelong socioeconomic disadvantage in a young adult experiencing a first psychotic episode? Is it A, the specific type of hallucination, B, the duration of untreated psychosis, or DUP, the presence of minor magico-mystical ideas, or D, a mildly elevated BMI at onset?
It's about the clock.
The answer is B. The critical window is defined by the duration of untreated psychosis, or DUP. Prolonged DUP allows the neurotoxic and social damage to compound irreparably, making early intervention via coordinated specialty care absolutely vital.
If you navigated those concepts successfully, you have a really robust understanding of the true weight of this illness. I strongly direct you to read Chapter 12.3 in Kaplan and Sadok for an even deeper exploration of the epidemiology and history we've discussed today. The clocks in the hall of human burden are still ticking, but the sharper our clinical reasoning becomes, the more power we have to ease the friction in the gears. Here are the details of this episode.
Global burden of schizophrenia. Byline. Schizophrenia affects relatively few people compared with many other illnesses, yet its lifelong disability, premature mortality, and social consequences make it one of humanity's greatest mental health burdens.